So exercise 9 and 10 are going to be combined in this video. Exercise 9 is covering the axial skeleton, while as exercise 10 is covering the appendicular skeleton. So as a reminder, when we're looking at the appendicular and the axial skeleton, what we're talking about are two different regions. So when we're talking about the axial skeleton, it is going to be everything that is on the midline, where the appendicular is going to be all of the limbs and how they attach. So as we're looking at this image right here, you can see that here is going to be our everything blue is the axial skeleton, whereas then everything that is going to be this other yellow color, all of the shoulders, arms, hips, and legs are going to be the appendicular. So you can kind of see that coloration on this guy right here. So when we're looking at our axial skeleton, it's going to be broken up into different areas. So we're going to focus on that first. So the first area of our axial skeleton is going to be our skull. So within our skull, there's two parts to it. There's going to be our cranium, and there's going to be our facial region. But we're talking about our cranium. It is made up of 8 bones. So looking at these bones right here, you can kind of see what's going on. So the 8 bones of our cranium are going to be the frontal bone. You will also have the parietal bone. You will have the temporal bone. You will have the occipital bone. You will have one called the sphenoid and a bone called the ethmoid bone. So these are going to be the bones that make up the cranium. You'll notice that I said that there were 8 bones, but I only named 6. That's because the parietal right here is going to have a 2. There will be a right and a left parietal, and your temporal will have 2. There will be a right and a left temporal. So in totality, your cranium is going to be made up of 6 bones. So when we're looking at our cranium, this is going to be the bones of your cranium right here. You can kind of see them all. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go down to this right here. So when we're looking at this, the yellow bone right here is your frontal. The side is going to be your parietal. So looking at the front, the frontal is going to be this yellow. He makes up this section, whereas then your parietal is going to be this red, and he will make up the latter half. He will make up this section. So that's where those 2 bones are. Then you're going to have your frontal, parietal, temporal was another bone that was made up of the cranium, your ethmoid bone, and your sphenoid bone. So when we're looking at those with your frontal, your parietal, your sphenoid, your temporal, and your ethmoid, when we come down here, you can actually see the sphenoid and the ethmoid are going to be on the side as well. And then you can also better clearly see the temporal bone. So this temporal bone is going to be right over top the ear. So that's this section. One thing that you can also see in this particular view that you cannot see up here is that this is the front. What you can't see is on the front is you have to turn it all the way around and look at it from the back. So this is the posterior view, so it's the back side. That's where you have the occipital bone. So looking at it from the side, this is how you can see the occipital bone. So that is going to be the bone that is on the back of the skull right here. That is your occipital bone. So if your frontal, your parietal, you'll notice that there are 2 of your parietal and temporal bones. That's because there will be one that is on your right side and one that is on your left side. So that's going to be your cranium. The second part that makes up your skull is going to be your facial. Your facial region. And when we're looking at the facial bones, there are actually going to be 14 bones in this section. So I'm going to take this and we're going to go down to the areas of our facial bone. I guess we're just going to do it right here. So looking at our facial regions, there are 14 bones. These are going to be your mandible, which makes up your part of your jaw, your maxilla. You will have a lacrimal bone, which will make up part of the socket of the eye. You will have a palatine bone, which is going to be part of the mouth, part of the roof cavity. Your zygomatic bone, which is going to make up the cheek bone. Your nasal bone, which helps structure your nose. Your vomer, which is posterior to the nasal bone, and then a bone that is called the inferior nasal conch. So these are all of the bones that make up the facial. You'll notice I said 14, however, I only listed out a few. So the mandible right here, all of these are going to be 12, except for mandible is only 1, and your vomer is only 1. But all of the other bones will essentially have a right and a left. So nothing crazy about these, except you're just having to remember that there's a right and a left. So when we go down and we look at this region of our face and we're looking at our facial bones, you'll notice here is your lacrimal, your zygomatic. So lacrimal is making up the tear duct. Your zygomatic is making up the cheekbone. Your maxilla, which is going to be only one bone, and that's going to be the front of your cheeks and the top of your mouth. Your mandible, which is going to make up the bottom half of your jaw. Your vomer, which is posterior to your nose. Your inferior nasal conch, which is also going to make up part of your nose. So you can kind of see where all of these bones come together. And then you have your nasal bone up there. If we take the pieces of your mouth and the facial region and kind of break it up a little bit, this is going to be the side or the lateral view, whereas this is essentially taking the skull and cutting it half. So this is what you're seeing right here. So you split it directly down the middle of the nose, and you're showing the inside. So you're looking into the inside of the skull on the side. So you can see how these bones are three-dimensional. When you get to the bottom of the skull, this is essentially taking your skull and flipping it so you are actually looking from the top down. So if this were our lovely little person who was laying on a table, you are looking at this point right here, straight up at the bottom of the neck. So this would be where your spinal cord is actually going to connect and your vertebrae is going to connect right here. And then that will be right here. So that's the section of the skull we are looking at. What you also need to know is that when you're looking at the skull, you are going to need to note any of the markings. So as you're looking at the skull, some themes that you'll notice is if there is a thing called a process, there is going to be something that is sticking out. If you have a foramen, that is going to be a hole. You'll notice this guy right here is the foramen magnum. Foramen is essentially going to be a hole. If you see a canal, it is going to be a smaller hole that may not go all the way through the bone. And if you see a condyle, like this right here, it's going to be a bump. So as you're looking at these, some things are going to be named based on the actual structure: a process, a foramen, a canal, a condyle. That essentially is just going to mean these things. So the name is actually going to be in the description, and the location could be in the name of the actual bone itself. So what we're doing with this one is we're going to actually take our lovely little person who is laying on our table right now, and we are essentially going to take off the top of his head. And so if you were to slice it right here, we are right now looking down into the bottom of the skull this way. So you are looking down into the foramen magnum, but from the top side down. So this is again the foramen magnum, but we're looking at it from a different view. So you'll notice that this looks hairy scary with all of these pieces, but all of these are three-dimensional. So you're only really knowing probably a handful, 30 to 40 different things you'll need to know for this section. However, all of these are actually shown in almost every single picture because they are three-dimensional. So as you're looking at them, don't just look at one picture. Make sure you're looking at it when you can manipulate the image yourself. The Mastering A&P will be fantastic for being able to manipulate these bones. Okay, your ethmoid and your sphenoid are bones of your skull, and these are actually going to be found here. So they're going to be behind your nose, deep inside your skull. So you can see where those fit right there. Here's a larger example of your mandible. So within your axial skeleton, your skull, you will also have a free floating bone that is going to be your hyoid bone. And your hyoid bone is the only bone not connected to another bone. It actually helps to anchor the tongue and give some of your throat muscles a place to anchor, but it is not connected to another bone. So that's your hyoid bone that will stay right there in your throat. Okay, here's a larger perspective of the orbit. But then switching to the second gear, this is our vertebral column. When we're looking at our vertebral column, there are 24 bones that make up this part of the axial skeleton. So you'll notice they are broken up into these sections. You will have the cervical curvature that will have 7 bones. These are going to be named C1 all the way to C7. C1 and C2 are going to have special names. So that is going to be the first 2 bones right here. C1 is the top, C2 is the second. That will be called the atlas and the axis. So C1 is the atlas, C2 is also called the axis. And they allow for your head to be able to rotate on your vertebral column. So that's cervical. You will then also going to have thoracic. So the thoracic is going to be 12. And these are going to be named T1 to T12. Nothing special. These are not named any other way. And then you're going to have the next region, which is going to be your lumbar. And your lumbar, you will have 5. And these will be named L1 to L5. So nothing special about that. And the next section is going to be your sacrum. Your sacrum are going to be 5 fused. So they are 5 and they are considered fused. And they are going to be named S1 to S5. And at the very, very bottom, you're going to have your coccyx. So your coccyx is going to be made up of 4 fused bones at the very, very end. It is not named with a C again. They're not named 1 through 5, but they look like a rattlesnake's tail at the very bottom of your vertebral column, where it will essentially look like a rattlesnake's tail coming down. So that's what your coccyx is. So when we're looking at our vertebral column, you'll notice that cervical is 7. So it's C is 7, thoracic is 12, lumbar is 5, your sacral is 5, and we're going to call your coccyx just 1 entire bone. A way that's easy to describe and remember this is breakfast is going to be first, and that's 7 a.m. Lunch is going to be 12 p.m. Dinner is going to be at 5 p.m. So breakfast, lunch, and dinner, 7, 12, and 5. That is the order it goes in. So that can kind of help understand your vertebral column. When we're looking at the vertebral column, this is the general structure that you do need to know. So this is a very important image to be able to identify these figures. All of these up here, all have the same structure. They're just going to be different sizes. So cervical are going to be small. where lumbar are going to be large. So they will progress in size from up here. These are going to be small, and these are going to be large. But they're all going to have the same structure, and they're all going to briefly look like this. You do need to know this entire thing, where there will be this center section that is the cutout, and then you will have all of these processes that will make up this vertebrae. So this part right here is what you actually feel. This is, if you were to take your fingers and run it down the back of your back of your bone, this is actually what you feel when you're feeling your backbone. So if we were to look at this image down here in your vertebrae, you'll notice that what you actually feel is going to be on this side, and it is all of these spinous processes that are sticking out right here. So that's what you're actually feeling. But it doesn't matter if it's your cervical, your thoracic, or your lumbar. They are going to follow the same sequence of events. So you do need to know these pieces. So when we said cervical, C1 and C2 were special. So C1 is atlas, and C2 is axis. So what you need to know about these is that they do look different. So know how these are different when you are comparing them to this structure. So that's really what the atlas and the axis you need to focus on for that. If you want to see how they all fit together, this is them broken in. And then at the very, very bottom, you can see how this is the sacrum. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So these are 5 fused bones that are making up your sacrum. So you can see how those are right there. And then your coccyx is going to be down here. Okay, so that is your one more section in your axial skeleton, and this is going to be your thoracic cage. So we've got our skull, we've got our vertebral column, and this is going to be our thoracic cage. So this is going to be made up of your sternum and your ribs. So your sternum is going to be essentially what we call our breastbone, and it is the bone that is right here. You do need to know all of the parts of the sternum. And then the ribs are going to connect to the sternum. So these are all of our ribs. So as you're looking at, you only have one sternum. It sits on the midline of the body, but you will have different sets of ribs. So looking at the ribs, you will actually have a total of 12 ribs. So that means if you have 12 ribs on the right, 12 ribs on the left, you have 12 ribs on each side, which makes 24 actual ribs total. So you'll notice there's these statements of true and false and floating. So a true rib will actually connect directly, not just connect to, but it will correct directly to the sternum. So you'll notice these guys right here connect directly onto that sternum. Whereas when you have a false rib, there is an indirect connection to the sternum. So when you have this indirect connection to the sternum, you'll notice that all of these guys right here are connecting not to the sternum itself, but they're connecting to cartilage of the rib above it. And then that is connecting to the sternum. So that's how you get this false rib. They are connected to the sternum, but they are falsely connected. So it's an indirect connection. Well, and then you have something called, within the false ribs, you'll have something called the floating ribs. And these ribs are the ones that are not attached to the sternum, or they are not connected in any way. They are going to float, and they actually will end before you actually get, usually don't go all the way around to the front. They kind of end on the side, but there is no connection to the sternum there. So you can kind of see how these ribs are attached. But you don't need to be able to name or number. You don't need to be able to number the ribs, but you do need to be able to know how they all fit together. So that's it for chapter 9. This next section is going to be covering the appendicular skeleton. So we're just going to move right on in. The appendicular skeleton. So looking at the appendicular skeleton, what we need to know with this is that this is actually going to be focused of, or comprised of, I apologize, 126 individual bones that will be covered in this appendicular skeleton. So it's going to be all of your appendages and how they attach. So that'll be your pectoral girdle and your pelvic girdle. So we're going to start with our upper limbs and your pectoral girdle, how they connect. So to start with, we're going to do our pectoral, otherwise known as your shoulder girdle. So that's what this section is right now. When we're looking at this, you will have a couple different bones. Mainly, you're going to have two types of bones. You're going to have, the first one is going to be your clavicle. Your clavicle is this guy and also this guy. It is your collarbone. You do need to know when you're looking at the clavicle, the medial end. So this is going to be on the midline, and this is going to be the acromion or the lateral end. So you do need to know the clavicle, your collarbone. The next bone that makes up the pectoral shoulder girdle is going to be your scapula. So this would be our shoulder bone, collarbone. It's not the technical term, but it helps you remember where they are. Where your scapula is going to be your shoulder blade. So it's going to be on the posterior side of the body. So when we're looking at our scapula, it is this guy right here. You'll notice that it kind of has a triangle type shape. So if this guy right here, this is the midline of the body, and it has a triangle type shape. That is important to remember. So this is our shoulder blade. So when you're looking at this, there are going to be 3 angles. 1, 2, 3. These are going to be named for where they are. So you'll have your superior angle. You will have the inferior angle. And then you will have the lateral angle. So you have your superior, you have your lateral, and you are going to have your inferior. So you need to know how these are, but you also need to know that whether or not it's a right or a left. So this is essentially going to be a scapula, but make sure you know how it positions in the body. And then not only are you going to have 3 angles, you're going to have 3 borders or sides. So you will have 1, you will have 2, and you will have 3. So these 3 borders are going to be superior, the medial, which is going to be the one that's on the medial side of the body, and lateral. So be able to name these 3 borders of your scapula. Okay, so that's making up your pectoral shoulder girdle. Now we're going to do your overall upper extremity of your arm. So looking at this, let me actually give it, there we go. So the primary bone of your arm is going to be your humerus. That is the upper bone that makes up your arm. So that's this guy right here. He is a long bone. So when you're looking at the humerus, make sure you know all of these pieces that make up the bumps, the connections, the condyles. You do need to know them all. Your humerus is going to be there's a right and a left depending on which arm you're on, but your humerus is going to connect to your forearm. And your forearm is going to have a bone that is your radius. This will be the lateral or outside bone, and your ulna, which is going to be the medial or the inside bone. So as we're looking at, this is how they connect. But as we're looking at this guy right here, you can notice that we will have two bones that are side by side, and it will be the radius and it will be the ulna. So when we're looking at this lovely little picture here, we're going to have, here is my person, here is their legs, but coming off their arm, you will have essentially this right here will be your humerus, and you will have your humerus on both sides. But your humerus is going to be connected to two bones. We're going to make his legs a little longer. So when we said that the medial and lateral bones were different, what we mean by that is when we look at this, this is the midline of the body. So this is the medial part right here. What we're saying with that is that this bone right here is medial, where this bone right here is medial. However, you can't go right or left. It is medial. The medial bone is going to be the ulna. So it's the ulna on both sides. The lateral bone is going to be the radius. So it is not right or left, because on this side, this is, remember, the right side of the body, and this is the left. This would be from right to left. This would be from right to left, but it's not always going to be radius and then ulna. So it's more out to in, where your radius is going to be your exterior or your lateral, and your ulna is going to be your interior. So you can see how those fit here. You do need to know all of these pieces as well. This is really cool because this is your ulna, and it actually does create a U shape at the top. That U shape is what connects to the base of your humerus to essentially, he will connect here, and it is your ulna, and it allows your bone to be able to move. So that is how you can bend your arm. So that's the radius and your ulna. It's very cool. So the next section on your upper extremities, we've got your shoulder, your arm, your forearm. The last part is going to be your hand. So as you're looking at your hand, when you're looking in this section, there are going to be three groups of bones. So you will have your carpals in your hand. Your carpals are going to be your wrist. They are made up of 8 bones. So this is your wrist. So looking at this, these are your carpals right here. The next section that makes up your hand is going to be your metacarpals. Your metacarpals are made up of 5 bones. And these are going to be the bones of your palm. So looking at this right here, these bones are your metacarpal. They are making up your palm of your hand. And then the next section is going to be your phalanges. And there are going to be 14 bones. And these are going to be your fingers. So when we're looking at your phalanges, you'll notice that it is 14 because there is 1 phalange, 2 phalange, 3 phalange. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. So with your phalanges, your thumb will only have 2. Whereas all of your other fingers will have 3. That's what makes 14 bones. So if this is going to be my palm and my wrist, and I'm going to have to do this one right here. So let me make that a little smaller. If I'm going to redraw this guy right here, and here is my phalange 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You'll notice that they're all going to be named the same kind of flow. From the medial side of the body, from how they connect close to the body to as they fall away. So these are going to be where these come into play. So all of these are going to be proximal because it's close to the body. And then you're going to have middle. And then you're going to have distal. So all of the phalanges that have 3 are going to have a middle, a proximal, and a distal phalange. And they are going to be numbered from the thumb. So you will start by numbering them from the thumb to the pinky. So if this were my palm, here's my thumb, finger, 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 finger. This would be 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So you can see those listed right here. So that's how you know to name from your thumb out. You can name them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, metacarpal, phalange, middle, proximal, distal. You need to know all that. Okay, so that was your upper extremity and your pectoral girdle. Now we're going to switch to the last section, which is going to be your lower appendage and your pelvic girdle. So your lower limb plus your pelvic girdle. So looking at this, we're going to start with your pelvic girdle. Your pelvic girdle is going to be made up of your hips, essentially. So it is going to be made up of 2 hip bones. And this is going to be called the coaxial. So this right here is a coaxial bone. So looking up here at your hip, we have 1 coaxial bone. Let me spell it right. And then a second coaxial bone. So pelvic girdle is made up of 2 coaxial bones. Each coaxial bone, this is where it gets confusing, has 3 bones. So if this is 1, inside this bone there are 3. If this is going to be that 1 coaxial, inside this bone there are 3 bones, and you can see them here. They are going to be the pubis, the ischium, and the ilium. So you will have the pubis, the ischium, and the ilium. So looking up here, you can actually see that the ilium is going to be the top of your hip, what you feel when you actually externally palpitate your hip bone. Your pubis is going to be the front of your hip girdle. That is going to be near your pubic region. And then your ischium is going to be the part of the pubis that is on the back, closer to your tailbone. So essentially it's top, front, bottom. That is what makes up the ilium, the pubis, and the ischium. So you can see how this over here, we're going to have our top on the ilium, our front on our pubis, and our back on our ischium. So that's kind of how that is made up. And they are 3 bones that are all fused together. Okay, so that is the pelvic girdle. The next one is going to be the thigh. So it's going to follow the same pattern that was our arm. There's going to be 1 large bone called the femur. This is your thigh bone. This is actually going to be the largest, heaviest and the strongest bone in the body. So to break your femur is a large feat, and it will also take the longest to heal. So that's your femur. It is a long bone. And then at the base of your femur, you will have a bone called the patella. That is going to be your kneecap. So this is your femur. You do need to know all of these pieces to the femur. Okay, so then after the femur, you're going to have your lower leg. So that would be your thigh. And now we're going to do your lower leg. So when we're looking at the lower leg, it is also going to be made up of two bones. You will have your tibia. Your tibia is going to be the medial bone. This is also going to be the larger one. And then you have your fibula. And your fibula is going to be the lateral, also the smaller bone. So as we discussed with your humerus and your radius and your ulna, where they had one bone, two bone, medial and lateral for your radius and your ulna, your legs are going to be the same way. So coming off your your vertebral column, you're going to have your hip bones, you're going to have your femur, just like that. So this guy is your femur. At the base of your femur, you will have your patella, which is your kneecap, and then each side will go into a right and a left bone. So just as a reminder, this is the midline of the body, which would be right down here. So we're talking medial and lateral. So looking at these, the one that is the most medial is going to be your tibia. So that's the one that's on the medial part of the body. And the one that's the most lateral is going to be your fibula. So it follows the same pattern as the radius and the ulna. So you do need to know how these work together, but you can see how with the tibia, it's the larger bone, and then the fibula, it is the smaller bone. Okay, so then after the bones of your lower leg, you're also going to follow same pattern and do the bones of the foot. So the bones of the foot are going to follow the same kind of general flow. You're going to start with the section of bones called the tarsals, and there are going to be 7 bones that make up your tarsal. This essentially is going to be your heel of your bone. So your tarsals will be these guys that make up the heel of your bone, the neck of your foot. The next section is going to be your metatarsals. Your metatarsals have 5 bones. So these are going to be the arch of your foot. So here are your metatarsals. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Here are your metatarsals. And then the next section you're going to have are going to be your phalanges. So this follows the exact same pattern as your fingers. They are also called the phalanges. So your phalanges, there are going to be only be 14 because this follows the same path with your phalanges right here, where they will all have 3, except your large toe will only have 2, which puts it at 14. These are also going to be numbered distal, medial, proximal for the exact same thing. So that is your foot. So as you're going through this exercise, you do need to know all of these bones and all of these pieces and how they all connect and fit together. Mastering A&P will be great for this since we can't be in person in lab. Okay, so we said that in the adult, there was 206 bones. Well, in the newborn, there is actually more bones in a newborn or in a child. So the way that you get the 206 bones is that bones will fuse over time. So when a child is born or a newborn, there's going to be things where there are bones are not yet connected. So these are going to be soft spots on the baby's skull where they are not yet connected. So these guys right here, these bones should be all the way connected, but there's not. There's space between them. There's space here and there's space here. These connections where they're not put together are going to be called fontanelles, the soft spots on the baby skull. You do need to know all of the fontanelles and where they occur in the skull. So you can see how this is the skull of the that matches the adult coloration to be able to give you this is the frontal bone, the parietal bone, the occipital bone, and the temporal bone, and the fontanelles are within all of these, how they connect between these. So you do need to know the fontanelles. So real quick, the ones you need to know are going to be the anterior fontanelle, the mastoid fontanelle, the sphenoid fontanelle, and the posterior fontanelle. These are the primary ones that you need to know in order to understand how these bones all come together. So there's also a summary of male versus female pelvis that your lab manual covers, and it is very important, but you do just need to understand the difference between male and female. So that is it for exercise exercise 9 and 10, the axial and the appendicular skeleton.